Throughout the 1990s, home console gaming was dominated by a few very popular genres. The platformer was ubiquitous, as Sonic and Mario drove the console wars of the early decade and spawned a plethora of imitators. But another genre that was synonymous with video games during the decade was fighting games. While there are a few predecessors to the genre, it was Capcom's Street Fighter series that popularized fighting games, with Street Fighter II being a cornerstone of design for the genre as a whole. From here, the fighting game boom of the 90s took off in every direction, with Mortal Kombat using digitized actors and graphic depictions of violence to earn the praise of Western gamers, Sega's Eternal Champions trying to blend the Street Fighter formula with a comic book superhero aesthetic, Fatal Fury and King of Fighters taking the more accessible Street Fighter formula into a far more hardcore experience, Samurai Showdown being the first weapons-based fighting game, and Killer Instinct flexing its graphically pre-rendered style. Before long, fighting games also leapt into 3D, with Sega's Virtua Fighter pioneering both the 3D fighting game as well as being one of the seminal early 3D video games altogether. When 3D consoles started arriving, Virtua Fighter would become a popular standard bearer for the Saturn, but the PlayStation would have it beat to the punch with its launch title, Battle Arena Toshinden, and then by Namco's much more popular Tekken series. But Sega was incredibly talented at turning out fighting games, with the Saturn getting Virtua Fighter Remix, Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Fighter Kids, Fighters Mega Mix, and Last Bronx, all from Sega during its brief 2-year period of viability on the US market. So Sony couldn't necessarily rest on its laurels or count on Namco alone to feed the hungry appetite for fighting games that gamers all around the world seemed to have. Namco would contribute a new series with its weapons-based fighter, Soul Edge. Square would try its hand at the genre with the more experimental Toll No. 1, as well as the realistic dueling game Bushido Blade. With the Saturn dead in the US by 1998, Tecmo opted to bring the first console version of its Dead or Alive series to the PlayStation, despite the arcade original being based on Sega's hardware. So if Sony wanted to have a hand in this genre, it would have to act fast. So it looked around and brought over a new fighting game from a little-known studio that had up until this point never had one of its games published in North America. This would be Bloody Roar. Originally an arcade game called Beasterizer, it was the product of a small Japanese company called Raising, which had been kicking around the Japanese industry exclusively up to this point, and was known, if at all, for its shoot-'em-up games. This would be the first of their games to come to North America, as Sony themselves published their game for the PlayStation in 1998, and its sequel in 1999. The main catch to this game was that the fighting characters here were zoanthropes, or people who can transform back and forth between human and animal forms. Think like a werewolf. This would be the primary conceit that players would need to balance as they fought one another. Evidently, this more niche fighting series got enough consumer support to justify taking a stab at moving it onto the next generation of hardware, as Bloody Roar 3 would come to the PlayStation 2 in June of 2001. Although Sony was no longer publishing, and that duty would now fall to Activision. By late 2001, two trends drove the studio, now renamed as 8ing, to look beyond Sony for its next step with its little fighting game franchise. One trend was that the PlayStation 2 was increasingly becoming a very crowded marketplace for virtually any game, as an explosion of games flooded the system in 2001. The other trend was that fighting games were very often graphical showcases, and thus really needed to push the latest and greatest hardware. So, it was with no small degree of surprise that the next target that 8ing would have for its Bloody Roar series would be a brand new entry for the GameCube. With the recent exception of Super Smash Bros. Melee, itself a kind of unique exception to the fighting game genre, Nintendo was quite out of the loop and out of step with the fighting game market by the time the GameCube arrived. After the Super Nintendo had been home to most of the big fighting games of its day, the Nintendo 64 had taken a different turn, with very few fighting games in the platform at all, and the few that were there of dubious quality. This was more just a consequence of the loss of third-party support across the board than due to any technical shortcomings. The cartridge versus CD-ROM problem that the Nintendo 64 had didn't really directly impact fighting games like it did for other genres like RPGs. With the GameCube, Nintendo had gone far out of its way to craft what it thought would be the ideal platform for developers. The GameCube is made to be very powerful, very flexible, but still easy to use and program for. This had turned out to be borne out pretty well by those developers outside Nintendo that worked with the system. However, thus far all we've seen is that this meant that third-party companies could quickly and competently port over PS2 games, really just keeping the GameCube in the running as a viable cross-platform release target. We really haven't seen any games from companies outside Nintendo's orbit that were made specifically for the GameCube. Well, the team behind Bloody Roar decided to take up Nintendo on what they were offering, and made for an excellent poster child for Nintendo's third-party aspirations with its purple cube. In an interview with IGN, Kenji Fukuya, the director of the project, explained that they had decided to take their next entry in the series over to the GameCube instead of the PS2 or the Xbox, due to the GameCube's advanced hardware capabilities. Specifically, he called out the built-in hardware effects for lighting and shading, as well as the general polygonal output of the system, to allow for them to totally rebuild and remodel all the characters from their PS2 game. They also made for more advanced environments, allowing players to throw each other through walls and take the battle to new parts of arenas. But above all, Fukuya called out the anti-aliasing capabilities built into the GameCube to make for very smooth edges to polygonal surfaces and objects, something that had been the main fodder of fanboy flame wars just 2 years earlier when the PlayStation 2 arrived in Japan with less optimized versions of Tekken Tag Tournament and Dead or Alive 2. He said that with all due respect to their last game in the series, there was no visual comparison to the PS2 game they just put out months earlier. So again, aside from the anomalous Super Smash Bros. Melee, here we have the first traditional one-on-one fighting game for the GameCube, arriving on store shelves on March 18, 2002. So what's under the hood here? Once we boot the game up, we're greeted with something new, an animated intro video. In fact, an anime one. It's incredibly high-quality video, on par with what you would have seen on broadcast television at the time. Hell, it still looks really good for standard definition video today. Being an intro to a fighting game, it's mainly just there to showcase each character. Now hopping into the main menu screen, we get one of those scrolling rotating menus. As we always do, taking a quick look at the options shows relatively little. Not too surprising for a fighting game. You can set match parameters, you can remap all the controller buttons. For some reason I had to turn on the rumble function. And strangely, for a game that wanted to take advantage of the GameCube hardware, two of the high-end features are absent here. There's no progressive scan output, and no surround sound. But I did turn on the autosave feature, which was nice. There's also statistics, so you can get arcade-like rolling screens of high scores, play times, and other stats. There's a robust number of different play modes. I started off with training mode, since I've never played a Bloody Roar game before. The training mode is like any other you'd see, and even a bit like the one we saw in Melee. You can try and learn to bang out any combos while the CPU player does nothing to stop you, or just get a feel for the kind of combat we're working with here. The developers said in interviews they were looking to lean towards the more simple pick-up-and-play style of gameplay. This puts them more in the Dead or Alive camp, which was famous for its rock-paper-scissors playstyle of very simple and almost always counterable fighting mechanics. This game does something quite a lot like that, as you have a punch, a kick, and a block that doubles as a grab when you're on top of your enemy, and dedicates 2 more buttons to going into beast mode and powering yourself up. Of course, you can pile up and combine some of these things to get different combinations of attacks, but really the main strategy this game is going for is having each player play a mind game with the other as to when to go into their animal mode and when to hold back in reserve, since you'll get much amped up attacks and power levels once you've transformed. But of course, this is only a temporary condition. You'll need to recharge, so you're likely to really only get one good bite at that apple during the course of a battle. Something this game incorporates that was getting popular at that time was tag team play, as Bloody Roar has both a tag battle and a versus team battle, setting you up for tag team gameplay both in the single player and multiplayer modes. If you're not familiar, this means each player gets 3 different characters on their team that they can either switch between during a battle or go through each when one is defeated, sort of like having extra lives in the form of another character. This adds the strategic element of using different characters against other characters, as each character in a fighting game usually has their own strengths and weaknesses. There's also a good old-fashioned survival mode, which simply sets you up to try and get as far as you can in a never-ending lineup till you're defeated, with limited health regeneration between rounds. Since Bloody Roar is on the simpler play side of things, I was actually surprised how much I was able to play this game. I'm not the best fighting game player, and do not have the focus to learn complex combos, so was worried I wouldn't have too much of the game to show, but I actually had a surprisingly good time with all of the matches I engaged in with the CPU. Of course, I'm still no fighting game master, so I eventually hit a wall on some of them, but the gameplay is really well balanced and never feels overly brutal or immediately putting the smackdown on you. In this, I think the developers really met their goal to make an accessible, well-rounded fighting game. Of course, the bog standard any fighting game would have would be the regular arcade mode for a single-player playthrough, and a versus mode for multiplayer. And again, no complaints here. No matter which mode you choose, the gameplay is the same, only the parameters are tweaked. There is no larger, unique adventure modes or anything of that sort. It's a very arcade-style package. It sets up fighting matches and you play them. Nothing outside of that here. What is here is some top-shelf graphical splendor. As we talked about, the developers at Aiding were eager to tap the power of the GameCube to make a showcase title, and they unquestionably achieved that. At this time, in March of 2002, the only other fighting game on consoles that could match this game would be Team Ninja's Dead or Alive 3 on the Xbox. The smooth anti-alias characters and environments are noticeably high quality. The texture work is fantastic, albeit something that most other big-name fighting games could probably match, like Soul Calibur, Tekken Tag Tournament, or Dead or Alive 2. But the multiple transparent environmental effects in the aquatic stage, the reflections pushed around on the floor for characters in other stages, the fire effects from certain attacks, and the copious use of motion blur are all kinds of flourishes the developers were talking about when they said they were looking to utilize the power of the GameCube. It's a shame the game doesn't support progressive scan output, since this seems like the kind of game that would translate really well into higher resolution displays. One note on the use of graphical effects, though, is that the motion blur was a popular showcase feature at that time, that this game might honestly go too far in using. It gets so consistently enabled that when both characters are going beast on each other, they almost evolve into 2 blurry balls of light smacking into each other, and the really nice and well-animated character models are lost in the shuffle. It's a nice and impressive effect at first, but like with some other effects we'll see over time, like bloom lighting, it can certainly be overused and defeat some of the other points of graphical pride a game has. Still, there's no denying this is indeed the graphical showcase the team behind it wanted it to be. Nintendo's efforts to craft an easy-to-program but still wildly powerful box for its day are on full display here, as this little team pumped out something on par with the monster Xbox launch title in just a few months. For fans of fighting games, it was a signal that perhaps after the drought of good fighting games on the N64, that Nintendo might be back on track. At the very least, it was something to fill that gap in the market. Plus, its easier to pick up and play style lent itself better than expected to the potential audience on the GameCube. It would eventually get its own later port to the Xbox, but for the moment in early 2002, this was a nice feather in the GameCube's cap, and a possible hidden gem depending on whether fighting games are for you.